Some new developments tonight on the situation in Syria. Secretary of State John Kerry spoke a little while ago, saying the agreement made in Geneva last week must stand with the strong support of the United Nations and global powers. But Russian President Vladimir Putin indicated earlier today that he is not convinced Syria will in fact turn over its stash of chemical weapons. Fox News' Leland Vittert is in Jerusalem with the latest details. Leland.
Melissa, the Russian president says he thinks, but he's not exactly 100% sure that his Syrian ally will end up giving up all of their chemical weapons as promised. Remember, it was the United States and Russia that brokered that grand deal. Still, President Putin of Russia is defending the Syrians and say he has evidence that it was not the Syrian government behind that deadly August 21st chemical weapons attack. The world has largely blamed the Syrian government because of the type of nerve gas that was used. The sarin gas was of a highly military grade quality, making it much more likely that it was the Syrian government. Putin says that's just not true. He believes that it was the rebels there inside of Syria. Speaking of the rebels inside of Syria, more bad news in terms of the infighting between them. Just today, one of the al-Qaeda-inspired jihadist groups took over a key town there right on the Turkish border. It was held by the largely secular rebels. Now it is the jihadists that hold that town. It's just one more showing of the core issue that is here to the U.S. in terms of the situation inside Syria. While President Assad has certainly committed some horrific atrocities along the way of staying in power, given the jihadists, how well equipped they are, how well armed they are inside Syria, the replacement to President Assad, if he ever leaves, may not be any better. In fact, could be worse. Melissa, back to you.
So clearly the cost of this intense situation over Syria is dire, both in the loss of lives and financially. Syrian President Bashar al-Assad sat down with Fox News yesterday at the presidential palace and had what some consider to be the audacity to say that the U.S. should pick up the billion-dollar tab to rid the regime of its chemical weapons. Listen to this.
It needs a lot of money. It needs about 1 billion. It's very detrimental to the environment. If the American administration is ready to pay those money and to take the responsibility of bringing toxic materials to the United States, why don't they do it?
Wow. Zuhdi Jasser is president and founder of the American Islamic Forum for Democracy. He joins me now with his reaction. I mean, what do you think of that?
Melissa, I'm just horrified at every bone in my body thinking about it's basically Hitler telling us that that he will hand over the gas chambers and that's all we're looking for, and that we should pay for that. And ultimately here you have a tyrant who is killing his own people and has been able to change the narrative through his PR machine, from Charlie Rose to the New York Times with Putin, and now unfortunately with this interview with his pal Dennis Kucinich, that has ultimately turned the narrative from being about genocide and war crimes and regime change to basically being how do we mobilize chemical weapons. And oh, by the way, let the Americans pay for it. No, not the Iranians that are putting billions into his killing machine, or the Iranians that really were victims of the same chemical weapons in Iraq.
I hear your outrage, absolutely. But if you went back in time to the day that these chemical weapons attacks took place and you said, U.S., if you will pay $1 billion, I will stop this and give you the weapons. I mean, that sounds like extortion. But if you're the victim of these weapons and they say, we'll hand them over for $1 billion, you don't think that's tempting or worth it?
No, because that is a facade. It is a mirage as to solving our problem. The problem is the terror state of Syria and its terrorism upon its citizens. It's a vacuum for Hezbollah, for Iran. That is the problem. The fact that they hand over chemical weapons, they can then produce them again later. They can shift them around. Certainly it may be one of the problems that we start to solve, but those chemical weapon stashes will take a long time to mobilize, and there are 1,000 to 2,000 a week dying. And I think America's moral standing in the world, we're being seen right now as being, I mean, look at this interview. It was posted by the Syrian government on their website. So there's nothing about it that Assad himself is embarrassed to show and is part of his propaganda. So, and look at Iran. Iran today has...
But you talk about his propaganda. You don't think it allows the world to see him for the man that he really is. For example, let me play this soundbite about his response to Dennis Kucinich when he asked him about the chemical weapons. Listen to this.
So just to summarize, you do have chemical weapons. You're prepared to go along with the plan to to destroy them, and that you're prepared to cooperate with the international community in that.
Again, as I said, what you mentioned, all are part of the international agreement, and when we agreed to join this agreement, we want to fully cooperate with this agreement, not partially. I think this is very clear.
See, Zuhdi, I think that seeing a soundbite like that helps your case because it shows a man who seems duplicitous, who doesn't seem like he's being sincere, who doesn't seem like he's telling the truth, and maybe somebody we shouldn't be making a deal with. You don't think it advances your cause to have him out there saying things like that and showing himself in his own words for who he really is?
Well, I think ultimately, if it's part of the picture, yes, but that's the only picture. And there are many that are saying, well, he might seem crazy, he might seem a little hypocritical and lying, but what else is there? And the other part of the picture is not being shown. The millions of Syrians that will never be satisfied with a political solution, that want freedom, that laugh at everything he says because it's purely pathologically lying. And ultimately, there are many Americans that are now being introduced to Syria that are only seeing this and get swayed by this and say, well, you know what, without him, we'll be left with al-Qaeda. And they're not really getting the other part of the story.
I don't know who gets swayed by the man that we just saw in that video. Let me also play for you what Secretary of State Kerry said a short time ago and get your reaction to that.
Let's not spend time debating what we already know. Instead, we have to recognize that the world is watching to see whether we can avert military action and achieve through peaceful means even more than what those military strikes promised. The complete removal of Syria's chemical weapons is possible.
What is your translation of that? What does that mean in action terms to you?
Well, in action terms, I'm listening going, well, wait a minute, a week ago we wanted to punish him, that the world can't sit by and allow weapons to be used without punishment and maybe a decisive blow to degrade his capabilities. No, now we're talking about it was basically to remove the chemical weapons, which would take a year, a lot of costs, and how do you do this in a civil war environment? So it almost seems as if we're stepping back, we're more of a paper tiger, we're letting Assad and Putin decide what our foreign policy is. In the meanwhile, Melissa, Iran now is starting to say, oh, we want to get rid of our nuclear weapons too. This seems to be working. We can get America to sort of go down to its knees by simply promising the moon. In the meanwhile, they continue to do things internally and lie.
Yeah,
exactly.
Zuhdi, thank you. We always appreciate your point of view. Thank you for your time.
Thanks, Melissa.